Welcome to today's presentation on accommodations, modifications, and supplementary aids and services. This workshop is being conducted by the ESU 13 Special Education Planning Team. The materials used for today's presentation were developed collaboratively with NDE's Department of Special Education IEP Facilitation Cadre and ESU 13's staff and knowledge and expertise. I'm Sarah Peterson. I'm a teacher of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing here at ESU 13. I'm also a coordinator with the Central Western Nebraska Partnership for students who are deaf and hard of hearing, based out of ESU 9 in Hastings.
I'm Megan Macy. I am the teacher for the visually impaired students at ESU 13. I serve all 21 school districts here in the Western Nebraska Panhandle. Today, our learning objectives are: you will be able to identify the difference between a modification and an accommodation. You will be able to identify supplementary aids and services, and you will be able to identify assessment accommodations and alternate assessment. Where do we begin? Well, once goals have been decided, then the team can discuss needs of services and placement, not the other way around. Please don't come to the table thinking that you have it all figured out before you even start the IEP meeting. Decide on what accommodations and modifications would best help the student succeed. We're going to start here with page 6, which is actually tab 6 in SRS, Program Modifications and Accommodations. And this is where you would add those things. All right, our first piece of information is areas of consideration for accommodations and modifications, which will go on that page 6. Your potential need areas are academic, which allows the student to access materials and instruction; sensory, which allows the student to process information and interact with materials and others; behavior, which provides information and tools to meet the needs of the student; life skills, which allows the student to progress in skills that are incidentally learned by typical peers. Now on this slide, we actually have a hierarchy, which is a pyramid. And at the very bottom of the pyramid is our basic, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it'd be our basic needs. So for a student that might need several different types of accommodations or modifications, we would want to look at the very basic things at the very bottom, address those needs first in order to get to a place where we can actually get them to access academic learning. So at the very bottom, we have the central nervous system. So if we have a student with sensory issues, we need to understand that if we do not properly accommodate or modify instruction, that student is not going to ever be available for us when we get to cognition, which is our academic learning piece, which is the overall goal. It's not the other way around. We can't address academic learning and create accommodations and modifications there first without bringing in sensory or behavioral or any of those other needs that student might have. Accommodations versus modifications. Now, these are two very different areas. So let's look at accommodations first. This is the how. It's a change in how the student will learn the same materials as their peers by altering access to the environment. Notice how I highlighted a few of those words. We need to change how the student will learn the same materials as their peers by altering access to the environment. So how information is presented, how students complete tasks, the way students are assessed for learning, the way the classroom is structured, and grading and credits are the same as the peers. So some examples of this. Maybe your student needs extended time. That's just longer access. Maybe they need underlined notes. That's just focusing the access. Preferential seating. Closer access. Book read aloud. Verbal access. Large print. Visual access. Modifications. A change in what the student is taught or expected to learn. All right, we have some key points here too. a change in the what the student is taught or expected to learn. This directly alters materials and or curriculum, changes the content, changes rigor. Grading and credits are different than peers. Here are some examples of modifications. Removing a difficult question, that becomes altered test material. Lower level text, that's altering the curriculum. Open notes testing, material provided. Modifying grades per IEP, criteria altered. In looking at some of these examples, I'm going to also talk about being a classroom teacher. Now, I taught 5th grade before I became a TBI. And one thing that sticks out to me is the lower level text, and that becomes altered curriculum. We also have to remember that most of our students do read on their own level. Now, if this is a class-wide modification that's happening where everyone is expected to read on their level, that is not a modification. Why is it not a modification? Well, that's because everybody is offered the same modification. You need to have this discussion during your IEP meeting. If you use something like a lower level text, which is altering the curriculum, you need to make sure that this isn't happening across all students within the classroom, or that maybe it's just something that's built into the curriculum and it's for all. Then it's no longer a modification. This slide here is just a fun slide for you. You can access this slide after our presentation and take a little quiz to see what you've learned. Accommodations, modifications, and 504 considerations. Now, we want to think about, does this student really need an IEP? Or maybe they should be considered for a 504. Well, in order to figure that out, we have to answer a few questions. Are services necessary for this student? If services are not necessary, if the student doesn't need any sort of direct services, you might consider a 504 plan. Are accommodations needed? Is the student accessing his environment, his or her environment, without any extra accommodations? And really think about this, because sometimes we just naturally provide accommodations for our students and we don't really realize that we're doing it. You have to think, if this student were to leave this school tomorrow and maybe even move to another state, and they're going to end up in a new classroom, do they need this IEP? Do they need something that says, I need accommodations? Now, if your answer to this is no, then you might consider a 504. Modifications are not needed. If you do not need any modifications for a student, then you really don't need an IEP. You should start considering a 504. If modifications are needed, then we can't consider a 504. The modifications are the what they're learning. If we modify the what, then you can't consider a 504. You have to have the IEP to outline what that looks like. Now, services are necessary. If services are necessary to attain life skills or learn new skills, some that come off the top of my head were Braille and orientation and mobility. My colleague thought about kids that need to learn new devices for academics and social skills. Well, then you can't consider a 504. If a student needs to learn sign language, we can't consider a 504. These are actual services that have to be built into an IEP, and we have to sit down as a team and we have to decide that those are needed. So therefore, 504 is out of play. But if the student is proficient now in Braille, I've taught them Braille, they're not requiring any sort of modifications, which would be very rare, you could then consider a 504. All right, we're back to page 6 again. And remember, page 6 doesn't always mean page 6 on the IEP. This particular page also has supplementary aids and services. And that's our next topic. Supplementary aids and services are aids, supports, and other supports that are provided in regular education classes or other education-related settings to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. And this is an IDEA regulation. Supplementary aids and services directly support the student. These services that support staff are actually listed elsewhere. It's on the same page, but there is a separate box for that. So what does this include? So we're thinking of ways that we can support an actual student, not the staff. Who's there for the student and not the staff? Well, that would be the paraeducator, could possibly be for the student. Like if we have a one-to-one, co-teaching could be there for the student. Now, what kind of co-teaching would be there for just the student? That almost sounds like that's for the staff, right? Well, maybe you need to co-teach with a teacher for the deaf of hard of hearing. Is that teacher there for the student, or is she there, or he, there for the teacher? He or she is actually there for the student. It's to provide more access to the educational environment. Special materials and consultation. All right, page 6, supports for school personnel. Now, these are services that can be provided just for teachers, paras, the school as a whole. So additional training that will be provided to staff specifically for the student. So maybe a teacher for deaf of hard of hearing might come in and teach all staff how to use an FM radio system in order for a student to access the learning environment auditorily. Maybe an O&M specialist, which is an orientation and mobility specialist, they could be coming in and checking out the whole building with the staff and showing them different ways to modify the environment in order for a new student who's visually impaired to access their environment. Additional meetings that staff will participate in to benefit the student, and consultations with service providers. And I can tell you that right now, many consultations that I have are directly with classroom teachers and paras in order to help them build materials and modify their curriculum in order to meet the students' needs. And I know that my colleagues are doing the same in the deaf and hard of hearing area as well.
Okay, moving on from page 6, we're ready to start page 7 or tab 7 on the SRS. We're going to discuss district and statewide assessments. When you address this issue within your IEP team, there are 3 options you need to consider. The student will participate in state and district-wide assessments without any accommodations, meaning no additional time, no alternate location, nothing. They're going to take it in a classroom just like their peers take it. Sometimes that's not realistic, so we want students to participate in those same tests, but with some accommodations, including that alternate place, maybe some extended time, maybe some more frequent breaks. Some of these tests get to be very lengthy, so if there are simple things we can do that allow our students to take the same test as their peers, we want to be able to build those accommodations in. The other option with district and statewide assessment is maybe the student will not participate. Maybe the student is a candidate for an alternate assessment type program. One thing we want to make sure we point out here, if you are putting testing accommodations in for students, that for district and statewide assessments, they need extended time, you better make sure that that extended time is also being used in their regular school environment. If you're having kiddos who use no accommodations to access testing in the classroom, normal tests, regular chapter tests, quizzes, then they probably should not be getting any accommodations on district and statewide testing. You also want to make sure you're checking out those accommodations and knowing, is that an accommodation that's provided by the test that is provided for all students taking the test? I've been in special education for a while now, and there was a time not too long ago where If we needed a student to have a test read aloud to them, that was an accommodation. Well, as technology has caught up and the understanding of testing has caught up, we do have some regional and statewide testing that already has that built into the computer program, where all kiddos can click on the audio button and have those questions read for them. So if you know that that's already an accommodation that's being provided for all students on that test, then that would not be an accommodation you would list within their IEP. So it's going to be really important that you work with your testing facilitators in your building to know what accommodations are already provided within each test. Okay, back on page 7, once you've addressed if a student will take tests with accommodations or without accommodations, remember we had that question in there about alternate assessment. So alternate assessment might be something that is offered for students who have significant cognitive disabilities. These would be students who have severe multi-handicapping conditions, and it is generally less than 1% of your overall student population. So for some students, no matter how many accommodations I give them to take a test, they will not be able to take that test. This gives an opportunity for your team and your school district to discuss the need for alternate assessments. Those of us who do NSCAS testing, for kiddos in grades 3 through 8 and in grade 11, there are alternate assessments provided for the English language arts and the math portions of those. And then in a few grades, there are also science assessments that can be offered. It is really important, if you are thinking this might be an option for students, that you are working with your local school district administration and you are consulting all the guidance documents provided by the Nebraska Department of Education. There's a great flow chart that's available in our handout section for these webinars. We encourage you to check those out and to discuss those options with your school district administration.
Now I want you to pay attention to one area on page 7. It's at the very top, and it's the section that's in like a yellow. Hopefully you can see it. If not, it's the very first sentence there at the top. There's a checkbox there, and it says the student is not required to take a state assessment during the year in which this IEP is in effect. And depending on your district, this could be a box that you may want to check, because as it is stated, students' grades 3 through 8 and 11 qualifying for an alternate assessment will participate in assessments, right? So, and then below that, it says our science assessments are in grades 5, 8, and 11. Now, if I'm making an IEP for a student that is in kindergarten, the IEP year will run from kindergarten and possibly into first grade. This student will not be required to take a state assessment during the year in which the IEP is in effect. Therefore, this box could be checked, and then the rest of the data below it is moot. I don't need to sit for another 15 to 20 minutes discussing whether or not the student needs an alternate assessment.
Also looking at the other end of aged kiddos, if you're doing an IEP on a student who is a senior, their senior year of high school, they are not required to take any statewide assessments. Therefore, you would also not be considering alternate assessment at that point. So thank you for participating with us today in discussing accommodations, modifications, and school supports and services. If you would like to receive professional development credits or hours through ESU 13, you can please fill out the Google form that is linked below in the comments for this video, and then we will get that information to you for your credit hours.